Light a campfire and everyone's a storyteller. Join us for some thought-provoking and beyond fireside chats.
Today, I'm joined by Dr. Andrea Marshall. She is a co-founder of the Marine Megafauna Foundation and the principal scientist for their Threatened Species program. She's also a National Geographic Explorer, owner and tour leader of Ray of Hope expeditions, and the champion of the Inhambane Seascape Hope Spot. This Hope Spot encompasses the Bazaruto Archipelago National Park in Mozambique, as well as much more of the surrounding waters and coastline. Andrea is currently in the field with the Marine Megafauna Foundation. So Andrea, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to chat to us today.
Of course, you're very welcome. It's nice to speak with you.
Andrea, as a dedicated scientist, explorer, conservationist, and a campaigner for our world's seas, why do you think it's important to protect, conserve, and restock our oceans?
Well, our oceans represent life. They dictate everything from our weather patterns, and they supply the world with really important protein sources. So whatever way you look at it, our life is dependent on the ocean, even from the air we breathe. And so it's really important to keep our oceans healthy from that perspective, from a selfish perspective. But it's also really important because the oceans keep all the ecosystems on the planet in balance. You know, whether they're in the water or those on land, having healthy oceans means that we'll have healthy ecosystems. And so just in terms of keeping the planet healthy, I think it's really, really important to kind of prioritize the protection of our oceans.
Couldn't agree more. You were, in fact, the first person ever to complete their PhD studies on manta rays. And soon after that, you founded the Marine Megafauna Foundation, or the MMF, as we'll call it. Firstly, I wanted to ask you, what is it about manta rays which drew you to study them? And then secondly, how did your passion for manta rays morph into the founding of MMF?
Well, you mentioned that very odd fact, and I think a lot of people I found it strange. In fact, I didn't realize or note the fact that this was really the first PhD that was done on mantas until someone from the media pointed it out to me. I was aware, of course, that no one was really studying them intensively at the time. And the reason that I began to study mantas wasn't just because I thought they were fascinating animals. In fact, I had grown up being incredibly passionate about sharks ever since I was about 5 years old. I was quite obsessed with sharks, which was very concerning for my mother, being, an only child, and she can hardly swim. So it's definitely not the profession she wanted me to go into. But I had been obsessed with sharks for a long time and the ocean, and I wanted to study them, and actually came out to Africa to pursue postgraduate degrees in shark research. But at the time, I was also volunteering for the kind of newly formed shark specialist group of the IUCN. And this group, like many of the other specialist groups, are in charge of kind of trying to understand the conservation status of specific species groups. So in this case, sharks and rays. So we were given different species to evaluate their conservation status. And it was a great time because, you kind of learn a lot about different species by doing a lot of the research into understanding their conservation status. And someone slipped manta rays over the desk to me one day, and I was quite excited because I've been diving since I was about 11 years old, and who doesn't love a manta ray? I mean, if you don't love manta rays, there's probably something wrong with you. And so I was excited. I was really excited to be able to do the assessment, the very first assessment on these animals. And I was absolutely shocked to find that no one really knew anything about them. I just found that incredibly odd that we know probably more about space or many other strange, they're strange things, but many other things that are much, further away or harder to study than some of the largest animals in our ocean. And so as I did that assessment, I was A, shocked by the lack of information, but B, also started to get incredibly concerned about their conservation status because, there was a little bit of information at the time suggesting that people were starting to target them and sell them in Asia. And so I thought to myself, this is really concerning, and I had always wanted to study one of the more obvious sharks, but I realized that there are hundreds and hundreds of species of sharks and rays out there we know nothing about. So when I stumbled across a very large and seemingly healthy population off the coast of southern Mozambique a couple of years later, I thought to myself, hey, you know what? It's not a shark, but I think this is going to be the way that I can value add or contribute to science and conservation, and I'm going to kind of throw my heart into studying this species. And of course, after about 6 months, I didn't want to go back to sharks because mantas are absolutely so fascinating. So to answer the second part of your question, they just completely draw you in. And I think one of the things that stood out for me really early on is that unlike many of the shark or other species of marine animals that I had kind of been fortunate enough to study up until that point, these animals don't swim away from you. These animals to you, and they like to have encounters with you. And so instead of feeling like I was chasing down animals or forcing studies on animals, mantas seemed to be incredibly receptive to being studied. And I could see immediately that they had personalities. They just didn't seem to have any fear. They liked to engage with humans. They could tell almost immediately that we weren't a danger to them. They were curious about us. And so it made it really interesting to study them initially. And then, of course, as I began to study them, I started to realize that they were really extraordinary animals that I think we had underestimated previously. And they started breaking all of these strange records, or, things from, they have the largest brain of any marine fish, this group. And that was extraordinary to me. We started putting tags on them, and they started traveling incredibly long distances. At the time when I first started putting the satellite tags on them, they became overnight the deepest diving fish in the world. And they have subsequently been beat by like whale sharks and other things. But really like incredible feats of athleticism. And everything that we were learning about them really just pushed boundaries and made us question of things. And so it became really exciting. I mean, in the first couple of years of study, I even described a second species of manta ray, which is pretty extraordinary for someone at 20 odd years of age. And so it just kept me engaged. It kept me on my toes, and it just kept me asking questions. And 20 years later, I'm still just as passionate, still asking just as many questions, and feel like, there's really good job security, because I feel like I could probably study them for the rest of my life and be perfectly content.
Wow. To sort of listen to you speak about them really answers the second part of that question so well. When I asked about what was it that caused you to found the MMF, you've just spoken so well into all the incredible things about manta rays.
I could answer that in saying that as I was doing my PhD along the Mozambican coastline, not only did I, fall head over heels in love with this species and the population here, I got very connected to it. But as I finished my PhD and those first couple of years after I had finished, I could see what was a very alarming trend, and that the numbers of mantas off this coastline, the rates of encounter of this animal along the coastline, we were seeing a decline in observational sighting records. And I started to wonder, is that just a blip? Or is this a bigger trend? Because we started to see the fact that these animals are under threat globally, and we've been seeing lots of population declines elsewhere. And so it really made me think, what would happen if I just took that PhD and left this coastline? I mean, there's no one else here to follow my work up, and I kind of told my friends and family and everyone I know, I said I was just going to stay in Africa for a while, but I think I need to stay here. And I actually asked the co-founder of MMF to come out from Australia. He was one of my best friends, and he had just finished a PhD himself. And I told him, the ability to do work over here, there's just so much potential, and I'm overwhelmed with the number of species that exist here, and I'm not able to study them all. I mean, we have tons of whale sharks. Would you be interested in coming out and maybe studying alongside me? And he says, well, I've never even seen a whale shark before. And I said, well, that doesn't matter. I mean, very few people are studying them. In a year or two, you'll probably be a world expert. And it was a joke at the time. But Simon has just finished co-authoring the definitive whale shark textbook last year. And as it turns out, I mean, he kind of also went from zero to hero, because when no one knows anything about a species, any contributions, any work towards determining more about the life history of these animals kind of makes you an expert almost overnight. And so the two of us decided, instead of going to work for a university or some other NGO somewhere else, that we would do the unthinkable and start our own NGO, which is really risky. But we thought, hey, we're both kind of at the forefront of studying these two really big, important, charismatic, endangered animals, and maybe we can start a foundation around it. And we did. And of course, we've subsequently grown into a global organization that studies much more than just mantas and whale sharks, but that is how we got our start.
And when you say much more than mantas and whale sharks, what other species are you talking about? What exactly is meant by marine megafauna? And also, why are they important to protect?
Yeah, so marine megafauna quite literally just mean sort of large, marine organisms. Usually those animals are quite iconic because of their size or because they're rare. And very specifically, our intention is to focus on ones that are highly threatened. So the ones that are vulnerable or to extinction or in fact critically endangered or something like that. We focus on these animals, as you've asked, because they're oftentimes the first ones to be removed from ecosystems. And that's usually because their population sizes are small, they're highly vulnerable to threats. Many of them have these conservative life histories, making it very difficult for them to build back their population numbers if they've been decimated by some threat. And, most of them can't really be bred back. You can't really breed back dugongs. You can't really breed back whale sharks. It just doesn't work. So once they've been extirpated or removed from an ecosystem, they're usually gone for good. So they require, I think, a little bit of extra special attention because of those facts. And so we've decided to focus on those animals. And we've also, as an organization, decided to focus on those specific species in the developing world where capacity is low to do this kind of research. So we don't really work in quote unquote like developed countries, where there is much more government funding and capacity to do this work. We really like to focus in, areas where the coastlines are remote, governments don't really have plans in place or strategies for conservation for these animals, and we can really value add to those conservation strategies in those regions or those countries. And so that's what marine megafauna is, and why I think they're important to focus on and protect.
It's so interesting. You talk about these larger sort of creatures that live in our oceans, and if you think about any sort of terrestrial animal that is of that kind of size, they've all been discovered and known about for a very long time. And it's incredible to me that there are still discoveries to be made, still species to be found in our oceans.
I mean, it's wild, and I love that though, because I do a lot of talks for kids. Engaging with youth, I think, is really important, because I feel like if you don't inspire that next generation to care, then we're not going to go anywhere. And in talking to kids, a lot of times I sense this frustration that for those explorers out there, they feel like they were born too late. They feel like there's nothing left to discover. And I hear that a lot. And I'm always so taken aback, because I tell them, like, we don't know a lot still about the natural world and certainly our planet. And I talk to them about discovering these massive populations of animals, like the world's largest population of giant mantas we've discovered off Ecuador, one of the world's largest manta populations we've discovered off urban Florida,
Wow.
where everyone says, but we've been living here our whole life. We didn't know we had manta rays. And I'm like, well, I didn't either. I probably wouldn't have moved to Africa if I knew I could study mantas in Florida, where I have a house. It's these discoveries are being made all the time. In addition to the second species of manta I discovered about 10 years ago, we're describing a third species of manta right now this year. So there's so much left to be discovered. We don't know where whale sharks give birth. Things like megamouth sharks, I mean, there's only so many records of them in the world. Things like giant squids are coming up. We don't know anything about their lifestyle or what they get up to, and they live in our oceans. So, there is so much left to discover. And I do love being able to take this information out to the masses, especially children, and excite them about the fact that there is stuff that we don't know left to discover, and that we do need to accelerate the pace of science in order to find this information out so that we can try and protect some of these species. It's really important to not just focus on figuring out how to get to Mars, but we need to figure out about, things in our own oceans so that we can figure out how to protect it.
That's so well said. And talking about finding out where all these other species are in our oceans and how many there are still to discover, can you go into some of the species that MMF are currently working to protect and the different regions that you are working in to protect them?
Sure. Yeah. So as I said before, we kind of got our start and are like famously known. I mean, I did a documentary called "The Queen of the Mantas" very early on in my career. It was a BBC documentary, and of course, that's how I got my little title that I can't seem to get rid of, called the Manta Queen. And so we.
Well, I see it's your Instagram handle
Yeah,
too.
and actually, it's a great way to connect with kids because I mean, all animals do need superheroes, so I don't mind it. I mean, academically, it's given a good laugh to some of my peers. But, we did famously get our start in mantas and whale sharks, and they are still incredibly important species to us in flagship programs that we have around the world. But it was also very important for us to start contributing to information gathering on other rare species so that we could kind of continue to learn more about these super rare or endangered species that not a lot of people have the privilege to be able to access or study. And so to give you an example of some of those, we're studying wedgefish at the moment in Mozambique. And quite famously, the rhino rays, which include the wedgefish, which are a lot of people call guitar sharks as well. They have just been kind of recently classified or named as the most endangered fish group in the world. And, they are being targeted across the planet for their fins. There's a huge issues with habitat loss. And they're being caught incidentally in nets, just because of their awkward shapes and things. And so their numbers are plummeting as well. And they've just gone unstudied for a very long time, to the point that people don't even know how many species there are, and let alone have studied them in the field. And so we took up this challenge in Mozambique, where we have quite high biodiversity for wedgefish, and are starting to study them. And I'm finding them absolutely fascinating. I mean, the challenge is real. I mean, it's, even though they're a coastal dwelling animal, unlike some of the other much more pelagic species that we study, they're very challenging to find and access and study. And so, it keeps it fresh and exciting for us. So that's a huge one that we're working on. We also, maybe over a decade ago, discovered that this animal called the small-eyed stingray, which is really the world's largest marine stingray, I think. It's a bit debatable, but it's certainly one of the largest marine stingrays out there. We did a range extension from the Maldives, which was the closest location that we knew of that it existed, to the African coastline, and assumed that it was just, maybe one or two of them swam over here from the Maldives, and that was probably the end of that. We subsequently realized that we were sitting on probably the largest known population of the small-eyed stingray in the world. This animal has barely been seen, let alone studied before, and this represents the very first research on these animals ever. So it's really exciting to be able to contribute to another really important species, obviously an important predator here. And so it's, very, very exciting for us to not just, and it's probably incredibly endangered too. So it's really exciting for us to be able to pioneer some of this kind of work, whether it's regionally or period, like as in world first kind of stuff. But we also we were doing the very first work on leopard sharks, for instance, along the eastern coast of Africa. I think we have the biggest program for black marlin in this probably part of the Western Indian Ocean. We're helping to study the dugong population here, which is the last viable population in all of Africa. So we definitely focus on a lot of different species, but we really try and pick ones that are critically endangered or are completely unknown to science, and which we need much more information on so that we can understand what their conservation status is.
You've mentioned a few different populations of marine megafauna, all around the world, the Maldives, Florida, Ecuador. You yourself have traveled to many different places, leading people on conservation-driven excursions to see manta rays, as well as some of the other incredible fauna that you've spoken about. Do you have a preferred location that you like to go and see these animals besides the Bazaruto Seascape? Or are the seascapes of Mozambique your favorite?
Yeah, that's a really loaded question. So I am very privileged in that I do get to travel around the world a lot. And that's come, from when I was young. As I mentioned, I learned how to dive when I was about 11. But I also worked in kind of the photography, filmmaking kind of seen since I was very, very young. And so I was fortunate enough to get to travel around the world professionally, even before I became a scientist, all over the place, helping to document these incredible national parks around the world or things like that. And so that really gave me context as a researcher. And so by the time I was running research studies of my own, I really already understood where the places that I might want to travel to abroad would be. Where, when I discovered a second species of manta, I already kind of knew where I might go and travel to find this, second species and be able to study it. The problem is even though I knew where to go, funding is incredibly limited in this space. It's we're all fighting over very, very little funding that's out there, and so you have to get creative. And I remember that Simon and I were sitting around one day and lamenting the fact, I am so grateful that people find the work that we do interesting and intriguing and reach out all the time. But I was really lamenting the fact that people would contact me all the time saying, I want to help, I want to come over and dive with you, I want to meet you and help you. And I couldn't really help facilitate any of those requests. I couldn't bring people out to rural Mozambique. And I kind of thought to myself, well, I can't really travel with people And I just thought it was a problem. And then at the same time, we were also lamenting the fact that we didn't have any funding to go out into the field to do the work that we wanted to do. And all of a sudden we had just one of those aha light bulb, epiphany moments where we were like, do you think people would pay to go on random expeditions with us to look for something, whether it's, a new population that we might be able to study or get access to samples that we wouldn't otherwise be able to get, or go look at a fishery that we've always wanted to look at? Do you think people would pay to go with us? And we thought, well, I don't know, let's try. And so we kind of put it out there and framed it like that, which is that if you guys want to get involved and help propel research forward by paying for these expeditions so that the researchers can go out and afford to be able to do these kind of excursions, would you do it? And of course, the request to participate just started pouring in. And so in that way, these tours have become a way to help facilitate getting our researchers out into the field, into the places that we need to go, whether it's places that we study on a regular basis and we just need the funding to be able to, have boats out there, or whether it's new places that we've never been to that we want to explore so that we can potentially do more work in those places. So I have traveled around the world and people always ask me, okay, I want to sign up. Where is your favorite place? And while there are certainly exceptional places, I think on my website, I list probably my top 10 favorite manta dive sites, for instance. For me, the Bazaruto Seascape, or this Inhambane Seascape in southern Mozambique, represents the most exciting frontier for diving for me anywhere in the world. And I say that because in a lot of the other places that we work, things are quite predictable. In that if I'm going to, certain locations, I pretty much know what I'm going to see. Every once in a while, there's a surprise, but I pretty much know what I'm going to see. Whereas this place, even after 20 years of diving, we see new things every day, and the conditions change so markedly, and the types of animals that we encounter are just so different from day to day that it really keeps us on our toes. And I've also yet to see, maybe outside of the Galapagos, certainly in the Indian Ocean, so much diversity, especially in marine megafauna. And I keep talking to people about how, this is really the marine Serengeti of Africa, that if we protect the seascape here, that we will, by extension, protect so many big, charismatic, iconic marine megafauna species that it will be the equivalent of, protecting the Serengeti, but in the marine environment. And so it's such an exciting place to do work. And I've become so passionate about this coastline, and also just promoting African oceans around the world and showing people that Africa is so much more than just their terrestrial landscapes and ecosystems, that there is so much on offer in terms of the marine environment in Africa that, I kind of want to focus all my attention here in Inhambane these days. I do still travel, but I just can't wait to get home and carry on my conservation work here.
That's wonderful. And it segues so nicely into my next question for you. You were recently named as the champion of the Hope Spot, which encompasses the Inhambane Seascape And this also includes the Bazaruto Archipelago National Park, which you've spoken so fondly of. Could you tell us a little bit more about Hope Spots specifically? Like, what are they? What is the idea behind them? And why are they so important?
Well, honestly, this is such a privilege. And we launched this Hope Spot this year in January. And for me, it was kind of like coming full circle in this, amazing dream. Because when I started off my career, especially as a young girl, I didn't have very many role models, right? I didn't have very many people to look to, that were strong female, scientists out there doing field work. Eugenie Clark, of course, but certainly Sylvia Earle for me was that figure that I always wanted to emulate. And I just wanted to be like her. She's been a mentor for me my entire life. And Sylvia really nailed this Hope Spot thing. I mean, it was a concept that she put forward in a TED Talk that she gave, and I really think it was a really important idea that she put forward, which is that sometimes governments are, and I'm especially living in Africa and working in Africa, I know this to be true. Sometimes governments are very slow to recognize and action the protection and conservation of really important areas around the world. And sometimes in order for them to pick up that pace, and in order for them to really recognize these important seascapes and do something about them, you need to motivate them in the right way. And that takes, developing research. It takes developing good media and international awareness of an area. It just takes a whole suite of different things to encourage government. And what better way to do that than to kind of invest in the champions who are already on the ground, who already know this, and empower them to be able to collect this information and work together in order to bring government around. And so her vision was to kind of unite these kind of Hope Spot champions around the world, help to provide resources and help to them individually, but also to build a network around the world of Hope Spot champions who had a vision of protecting these areas. So a Hope Spot doesn't necessarily mean that area is currently protected. It may well be, but a lot of times it's just the identification of a place and an identification of a champion or a suite of champions who will hopefully be able to, over time, protect that area with government. So it's an honor for me, because of my passion for this place, to be recognized as someone who has invested, a serious amount of her life here. And I think Sylvia knows that I'm never going anywhere, and that I will spend every last breath I have to try and protect this place and try and create a network and team of other individuals like Tessa, who can help us get the information that's needed and get the attention that's warranted, so that the government will stand up and pay attention and hopefully secure some protections for this area.
It's interesting that you've mentioned that Hope Spots aren't necessarily areas that are already protected. It might include a protected area, but the entire Hope Spot is not actually protected. So how much of the Inhambane Seascape, Inhambane Seascape Hope Spot is protected? Is it just the Bazaruto Archipelago National Park? And then are you sort of campaigning to have the other parts of the coastline which are included in the Hope Spot? Are you campaigning to have those protected as well?
Yeah, so exactly. And that's exactly, I think, the point of Hope Spots is that it is a hope, right? If they're already completely protected and well managed and, secured, you probably wouldn't need to be that hopeful. You already kind of had it done. So Hope Spots are very much kind of a way to say, what is it that we need to accomplish here, and creating a roadmap to getting that done or that protected. And so for me, after doing work here for the last 20 years, we've identified that the Inhambane province of Mozambique, of southern Mozambique, is probably one of the most important areas, if not the most important area, in the country to protect if we're concerned about threatened and endangered marine megafauna species. They all seem to spatially aggregate here in this 350 kilometer area. And once we identified that area, we said, okay, well, that's the goal. right? And then we're going to tackle it in stages. So the Bazaruto Archipelago National Park in the northern extent of the Hope Spot is already protected. And also, just to the south of the park, there is a small sanctuary called the Vilanculos Wildlife Sanctuary that also has some formal protections. Next, in terms of our phases, we are working with a big philanthropic group and government to develop or kind of expand the Pumen Special Reserve to the south of the sanctuary. So this is going to be an area that will probably increase the protected area footprint by 50% of its current protected status, which is significant. But the most important part is that it's adjoined. So that means that already, if we pull this off, which it looks like, the government is very supportive of, that it will by nature start to create a seascape where you have a length of coast that's all adjoined, that being protected, managed by different NGOs and groups, but still a network of protected areas. And that will represent almost a half of what we need to in the province, because at the same time, the Bazaruto Archipelago National Park is seeking to expand slightly to the north. So those three protected areas would already, if we pull off those expansions, kind of protect 50%. And once you have the momentum of protection and people can see the benefits of creating this protected seascape, we hope to inspire, additional extensions to the south in the province over the next kind of 10 to 20 years.
That sounds amazing. I mean, just the sheer size and I guess the connectivity is also so important for those seascapes.
Super, super important, especially when it comes to large, more highly mobile migratory species like we're working on. And the benefit is that if you are focusing on creating spaces that will accommodate large animals, and this applies to terrestrial fauna as well, then you're going to be creating habitats that are going to be suitable for them, but of course suitable for all of the smaller animals that don't need to travel that far. So, by creating these large seascapes for these large mobile marine megafauna, we know that we're also creating very healthy spaces for all of the other, kind of reef-dwelling animals that are living within that area too, and also protecting the food security of this province in the future, which is also a very serious concern. This isn't just about, protecting the natural heritage of Mozambique and just iconic animals or tourism. This is also really about the health of ecosystems here and food security to make sure that, there's enough food to feed Mozambicans well into the future.
And so you've mentioned the food security. You've mentioned the incredible biodiversity which this area holds. And you've also mentioned tourism. Are there any other important reasons that areas like the Inhambane Seascape Hope Spot should be protected?
Well, for me, I obviously am focused on the conservation of these, specific marine megafauna focal species that we're concerned with. But one of the reasons that these animals are here to begin with is that the oceanography of this coastline is such that the very narrow continental shelf along this particular province creates this incredible nutrient upwelling off this coastline. So it's a very special environment because there is so much nutrients being upwelled along this coastline. So it means that there's a lot of biomass here because there's a lot of food here. But in addition to that very specific oceanographic feature that makes this area so special, it kind of really straddles the tropical and temperate kind of mixing zone where you have incredible biodiversity. So when people are talking about these priority areas to protect globally in our oceans, and everybody's fighting for 30 by 30 and trying to figure out, what to prioritize. A lot of people have really focused on these KBAs, these key biodiversity areas that have really high levels of biodiversity. And by protecting them, you're obviously going to be protecting more species and that biodiversity. And so this area has been identified as a KBA. We know it because it straddles that, temperate / tropical zone. So we have kelp forests in this province. We have, rocky reefs in this province. We have coral reefs in this province. We have mangroves in this province. We have, tidal flats. And I mean, just the types of environments go on. And because of all of those different types of environments, we have really high biodiversity because, they allow for so many different types of species to live, in at least one of them. And so it just makes it an even more important place to protect. It just doesn't have high biodiversity in terms of marine megafauna species, but it has just general high biodiversity. And so it just makes it the perfect area to protect. Plus, it's also incredibly beautiful. The infrastructure is such that I think tourism could explode along this coastline, and I really hope that it's done sustainably. But I think there's that good mix of the conservation need is there. And I think for Mozambique, they've really been slow to get the international tourists to pay attention to them. They're bypassed a lot because people go to Kenya or Tanzania or Botswana or, somewhere else for the grand safaris. And no one was coming to Mozambique. And I think Mozambique can really redefine itself as a place where people can come and experience coastal East Africa and Africa's oceans. And it can be a point of difference, something that can be a draw card for them. And I'm really, really excited for them to be able to develop those ideas hand in hand with like these grand conservation, agendas.
Well, I think you've already found the perfect marketing point for it, being the marine Serengeti. It makes so much sense.
I'm pushing the angle hard.
So through the MMF, you have collaborated extensively with Oceans Without Borders as well as the Oceanographic Research Institute. Could you tell us about some of the work that all these organizations are doing in the Inhambane Seascape and which species are being monitored and why?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I feel incredibly fortunate and privileged to have so many great collaborators. The work that we do is very difficult. And I mean, even though we have teams all over the Inhambane province, a lot of the work that we're doing on these highly mobile species requires a regional approach. So it's amazing to be able to partner with Ori down in South Africa, specifically with Dr. Ryan Daly, who is like an absolute expert in bull sharks, which we also have a program for, but in so many other species as well. He's one of just those mythical kind of, field researchers that is just seemingly good at everything and is just so good in the water. He's very notably a fishing scientist, which we are not. So he has been really instrumental to helping us branch out in terms of our ability to do certain types of field work. I mean, we've always been very in water, approaching animals in water, tagging them in water. And there's numerous species that we're working with now that we just can't do that. So he has been really instrumental coming out and teaching us new techniques, ways to be able to tag them that we haven't ever tried before. So that's been really great. It's been so wonderful to work with Dr. Tessa Hempson, who came to us really from northern Mozambique, where she was run out of her research center up there, at least temporarily, because of some of the conflict up north and the terrorism. And it's been so wonderful to get to know her because, as I said before, it's not common for me to find really powerful female research leads that I have so much in common with. And she has this really wonderful collaborative approach to everything, really. And it's really nice to sit down with her and dream up what we can accomplish here together as a team, where we don't have to worry about, competing with one another. All we're worried about is how we can tackle the bigger issues by each taking responsibility for something else. And I think that's the real beauty of finding people that you can work well with, is that you can accomplish so much more as a team if everyone sits together and strategically looks at what we need to accomplish and how everyone can value add. Unfortunately, that's not how it works a lot of the time out there. As I mentioned previously, there's very little funding. There's a lot of competition, and sometimes marine conservationists are not always working together. And so for me, it's really, really nice to be in an area where we are all collaborating. One of my favorite projects that we're working on together at the moment, all three of us, or we're trying to extend the South African acoustic array, which is, of course, the listening stations that are put down that work in conjunction with acoustic tags we place on these migratory species. We're trying to expand that array in South Africa, which is pretty big and intense, up to Mozambique. And we're doing a really great job of it. I think by the end of this year, we'll probably have like 50 different receivers down between southern Mozambique and the Bazaruto Seascape. And so, and that would never have happened without these three different organizations coming together and saying, we want what South Africa has. In order to advance research here along the Mozambican coastline, we need to do the same thing. We need to build an array here. And I think most people would have been too intimidated to do it alone. But by the three of us sitting down together saying, how can we build this and manage this together? All of a sudden we figured out that, that it was possible. And we're very excited to see that to fruition. So yeah, it's really great to have buddies out there helping you. It's not an easy job. So it's nice to have people out there that are encouraging you and collaborating with you.
So can you take us through what a day in the life of a marine scientist might look like if you're trying to extend this array that you speak of? And could you explain to us how these arrays work? The species are tagged and then the species swim past the array. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, sure. And that's actually a great way to talk about maybe just like what a normal day looks like for us anyway. And yes, we do different things every day, but when we're trying to accomplish something like extending an array into Mozambique, you have to think of it in terms of like what we need to do on a daily basis, but also what it looks like to maintain that receiver array over time. So in order to get those 50 or more receivers down in the country, we first have to actually build the receiver base station. So, we have to build these giant cement blocks, and then we have to impregnate some type of, like a rebar, like a stainless steel rebar or something into them, and then attach these tiny little receivers, which are about the size of like a Coke bottle. And they kind of attach to the side of these base stations. But once you build it on land, you obviously have to then get this massive cement base station out into the ocean. But before you can even get it out into the ocean, you have to identify the places that, would be best to place these stations. And sometimes that takes 6 months of diving and exploration for us to find a new area where we believe that one of these receivers should be placed. You cannot place receivers everywhere. It's impossible. And so you have to be very strategic about it. You do tag these animals with these small little transmitters, and they can go anywhere in the ocean. So in order to acquire, data efficiently, you have to place the receivers in areas that you want to ask questions about. So we usually are putting them in areas that we consider perhaps critical habitats, or we're asking questions. Is this a critical habitat? Or sometimes we suspect it's a critical habitat and we want more information on that. So sometimes it's looking for where they aggregate, looking for something like a cleaning station in mantas or in wedgefish or something where the animals are going almost every day to be cleaned. We oftentimes put a receiver down in those locations. Sometimes we find with whale sharks or bull sharks that there's a specific area where they tend to be feeding a lot or aggregating to feed. So we'll put down receivers in those locations. Sometimes there's a bay where we feel like they do a lot of resting. There might be a mangrove where we think that the babies are being born, or it might be a nursery ground for these animals. And so you strategically place the receivers around, the coast like that. It's really hard to get them down. And then once they're down, you actually have to, with these 50 receivers across a huge province, you have to maintain them. You have to change the batteries. You have to clean them to make sure they don't get fouled. You have to download the data periodically. Every single time there's a storm or a cyclone, we have to go pick up the entire array to protect data and protect the instruments. It's really, it's a lot of time and effort that goes into it, which is why most people would be nervous to take it on themselves. And so by teaming up and saying, okay, this is going to be a joint effort, we can accomplish it. But then in doing so, not only does it support our individual research of the three different organizations, but it also supports anyone doing research in Southern Africa where their animals might just come up here, whether it's accidentally or they didn't know that their animals, there was connectivity up here. We're getting a lot of South African scientists who are getting really excited because we're getting hits on our receiver up here in Mozambique from their animals that were tagged in South Africa, and they had no idea they were even moving into Mozambique. So we can also help a lot of other people support a lot of other research programs by maintaining this array over time so that we're kind of helping to facilitate anyone doing research in the region.
I think you've spoken so well into how important collaboration is, and what you can achieve when you team up instead of trying to go at things alone. So that's really, really nice to learn about all the collaboration that's happening in the marine conservation space on our coastlines. And I also wanted to ask, in this project that you are working on with Oceans Without Borders and ARI, which species are being monitored?
Well, as I said before, we kind of divvied it up a little bit, and we're approaching it from a perspective of like how can we value add as groups? For us, we specialize in things like whale sharks and mantas and now wedgefish and leopard sharks and some of the stingrays. And so we've decided to kind of, keep to our strengths and focus on them. Tessa had been working on like gray reef sharks and things like GTs in other parts of the country. And so decided, well, I already really know how to do that and target them. So how about I bring that into the fold and we can start studying those species down here as well. Ryan's a bit of an all-rounder. I mean, he'll help anywhere. And he's the kind of one who likes to help with things that no one else can figure out how to tag. Things like we've always been interested in hammerheads here, but they're very, very tricky to catch. And as I mentioned before, we're not fishing scientists, so I can't tag them underwater. And so it's been a real pleasure to have him up here trying to crack that code and figure out how to get tags on the hammerheads here. But he's also very interested in bull sharks, so he's come up to collaborate with our field researchers to tag more bull sharks in the region. He also helps Tessa as well because he's also very interested in giant trevally. And so we focus on slightly different things, but we're also always collaborating. If we can help one another, we always will. But we also want to make sure that everyone's playing to their strength as well.
And so a lot of the species you've mentioned are predators, maybe even apex predators in their environments. Is there a reason why it's important specifically to protect these species?
Sure. I mean, like I said, a lot of the species that we're studying, they have their themes. Some of them are highly migratory, and we feel like they're going to be good representative animals to explain things like regional conservation efforts and how to go, be a good case study for these regional conservation efforts. So, there's those aspects that they have in common. Many of them are, important tourism species and or like endangered. And so from the perspective of learning more about them from both of those angles, I think it's important. But you've made another point, which is that many of them are significant and very important predators in this ecosystem. And it's really, really important to protect the predator. And we also studied things like brindle bass and potato grouper. And those are also kind of one of those big boss predators out here on our reefs. And and as with the marlin as well. And it's really important to protect the predators because they help regulate, the prey items. They, really are responsible for, keeping the balance of those ecosystems, keeping the reefs healthy. And so it is important for us to know what they're doing, what their status is like, and if there are declining trends, we need to be aware of those so that we can put more emphasis on the conservation of those predators that are going to keep those ecosystems healthy. And the managers of both the Bazaruto Archipelago National Park and also the sanctuary have really mandated us to focus on things like the species that are important for conservation because they're endangered or tourism, but they've also asked us to focus on these predators because they know too that those are incredibly important species to study. So we have it really from management itself that they would like to focus on these animals going forward. And so we're very excited to be able to provide them with data that might be helpful for their management going forward.
So you've already spoken a little into this, and I could honestly listen to you speak about marine conservation for at least another few hours. But the last question that I have for you is, what are the major marine conservation goals for the Inhambane Seascape going forward? You've spoken already into management of the national parks and other conservation areas have mandated you guys to do the work that you are doing and to investigate these species. But what are your goals and the overarching goals for marine conservation in Inhambane going forward?
Well, it's a really nice question to end on. And, it allows me to talk about some things that I haven't really spoken about. I mean, I talked a little bit about our goals with the Hope Spot of extending protection throughout the whole province and kind of developing this seascape of, smaller protected areas along the coastline. And that's, of course, probably one of the most important overarching goals of the work that we're doing here. And I've also talked a lot about research. I mean, I feel so strongly in that conservation and management really needs to be underpinned by good science. So often we are missing opportunities to do good quality management and conservation because there hasn't been good science done first to help inform it. And a really good example is the Bazaruto Archipelago National Park. Its specific mandate when it was created 50 years ago was to protect the dugong, which is the last viable population of dugong in all of Africa. And only in recent years, when they started to be studied properly, and my husband was a part of those initial efforts, especially using aerial surveillance to study them, it became alarmingly obvious that the majority of the dugongs, and the paper came out, a few days ago actually on this from the park and African parks, that the majority of the dugongs, and in terms of their aggregation areas, are outside the park boundaries to the north. So for the last 50 years, there's been a park here that's mandate was to protect dugongs, only that they didn't do good science and they didn't have the boundaries set properly. So for 50 years, we've missed opportunities to protect this population properly because the science wasn't done. So I really, really strongly believe in helping to encourage more science along this coastline, not just doing more ourselves, but encouraging more scientists to come along the coastline. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, I think the conservation of this coastline, is really only going to last and be viable if we get buy-in from local communities too. And so a huge portion of what we do in Mozambique, and one of the reasons that we live here and we operate 365 days a year here, is so that we can connect with local communities, engage with them, have education programs. And we do that in most of the parts of the world that we work, but we found it particularly difficult along this coastline. And that's because when I first got here, I realized that there was this major disconnect. There's really no religious or cultural, they don't identify with the ocean in the same ways as certain indigenous communities in the South Pacific or in Southeast Asia, and people find the ocean here hostile. Many people die, they drown, fishermen get lost at sea. It's a hostile ocean here, and people have just become disconnected from it, or maybe they were never connected to it to begin with. So it's very difficult to get people on the same page and backing marine conservation if they don't have a love or an understanding of it. So I think it's really, really important to put significant efforts into educating local communities along this coastline, inspiring them, getting them excited about the ocean, and empowering them to feel safe. We've taught thousands of kids how to swim. We are teaching rangers more about the places that they're protecting. We're teaching government more about these places that they're supposed to be safeguarding. And I think, just the entire community here that we need to uplift in terms of education and connecting them to the oceans. And then we also have to make sure that as we talk about conservation, that we can do that without affecting local communities too much. We need to provide alternative livelihoods, and we have many, many programs in place for that, and so do many other groups along the coastline. And we need to really think about, the fact that, if we want to conserve some of these areas, it's going to mean that some of these communities take a hit in terms of their food sources or in terms of the way that they make money. And so how can we bring them into the conservation equation and make it balanced and equitable for them as well? And so I think that's a really important part of the story, and that needs to be kind of balanced with a same kind of creating these protected areas and doing all of the science. We can do all of that, but if we're not also protecting the interests of the people, then it's not going to go very far. So it's a big puzzle. It's not easy. It's one of those things that's going to take decades to get right. But I think we're well on our way, and I have a lot of hope for the future.
Well, thanks, Andrea. That last thing that you mentioned about having buy-in from local communities in order to ensure that areas like this remain protected and remain viable for generations to come really resonated with me, and I'm sure it'll resonate with a lot of people who listen to this, as will almost everything that you've said today. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciated it, and it's been lovely to chat to you.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you for listening to Leave Our World a Better Place. Don't forget to subscribe to make sure that you never miss an episode. If you'd like to find out more about And Beyond, please log on to our website at andbeyond.com.